Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Diaz. We're here with Leslie Carpenter, and Leslie Carpenter is one of those people that I know from Facebook, Twitter, and I think I met her at a conference. But it's funny because when you know people through the internet, you know them, but it was so great to get to see you in person at the Treatment Advocacy Center symposium to promote AOT. And if you know anything about Leslie, she is just a perfect role model for an advocate because her and her husband Scott had no platform, and they just went out and created a platform, and they just went out and started doing advocacy. So that's something when I was first getting started in advocacy, I was like, who am I to be an advocate? I don't have my degree is not in mental health, and so we're now joined by a great role model. So Leslie, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and Leslie, where are you from originally, and where do you live now?
Sure. So I'm originally from northern New York State, a small little place called Governor, New York, which is about 2 hours north of Syracuse, so up near the St. Lawrence River. And where I am now is in Iowa City, Iowa.
Iowa City, Iowa, and is that where the University of Iowa is?
Yes, exactly where it is.
All right. And now, the first question is, what were you familiar with anything related to schizophrenia before your son was diagnosed?
No, I would say the most familiar I was taking abnormal psychology in college while I was working on getting my physical therapy degree.
All right, taking abnormal psych while getting your physical therapy, so it wasn't
Right.
very in depth.
No,
All
it
right,
was not in depth.
all right, and one thing problem that a lot of people have is that when your loved one has cancer, you have a social worker or someone there that walks you through the process. But for people like us, was anything like that available for you when your son was started developing schizophrenia?
Not in any meaningful way. No, especially not for the family.
All right. And when your son was first diagnosed, it's very common with me, with a lot of people, but as someone who has schizoaffective disorder, I first went to the psychiatrist for depression because I was doing what was called double booking, where yes, I was depressed, but I wasn't really saying what I was feeling, what I was thinking because I knew how it sounded. And then after I was seeing the doctor for about a year taking antidepressants, I kind of bottomed out and just started lowering my filter. And what I've seen a lot of, but basically, let's talk about your son and how he got into treatment.
Sure. So, unfortunately, you don't always know what you have on day one. And these illnesses, as you know, start out one way and then they evolve over the course of years. So, our son first presented as being suicidal actually in 2008 one day. And then he was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, but he had his first manic psychosis in 2011. And at that time, everything looked like a bipolar type 1 disorder. But 2 years later, he began hearing the voices and having different beliefs and delusions. And that's when they progressed him to having a schizoaffective disorder. And I would say that in talking with a lot of other families and people, this seems to be pretty common. And some of that may be that our son had some of those symptoms earlier, but didn't tell anyone, or it just evolved like that. And I think both options are possible.
All right. And sometimes I see people blame the doctor, like the doctor made it worse. Did you ever feel that way?
I did. And I did because initially, when he first was suicidal and being diagnosed with depression and anxiety, that's when I started calling around and asking family about any family history and learned that my father had had bipolar depression. And so we shared that with the psychiatrist early on and said, hey, from what we're reading, it looks like he should have a mood stabilizer just in case he really does have bipolar disorder coming on. And we got nowhere with that. They were not willing to prescribe a mood stabilizer until he had that first full on psychosis, which I think is a real tragedy. It would have been possibly very helpful, right,
Oh,
if he'd had that treatment sooner. But unfortunately, there's a reluctance among local doctors. I can't say for all of them, but there's a lot of reluctance to prescribe preventatively when there's a family history, but the person themselves has not shown signs of mania yet.
okay.
Um,
And you're saying you don't know if that's a local Iowa City thing or if that's a national?
right. I think it is national, but it's just unfortunate because really they should take in the full family history. And if they'd done more in-depth history taking, I think that there were signs that were there earlier that we didn't recognize as a family because we didn't know enough yet. But if we'd had a better two-way conversation with the treating providers, I believe that could have been sussed out. There were signs there.
Okay. And did your son ever accept treatment?
I would say yes. I would say within the past couple of years now that he's been had received 2 years of care at the state hospital, finally getting the care that he needed for a long enough time. He is now accepting treatment, understands the value of his medications, which is huge.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say it's full on insight, but it's more insight than he's ever experienced throughout the whole time frame that he's been
Mhm.
sick.
Mhm. One thing that helped me take, my medication is that I was allowed to agree to take the medication without admitting I had a schizophrenia-related disorder. So I wasn't forced to, like, acknowledge anything like, "Alright, I'll take it." I was in a clinical trial at Emory University, and I got paid to be in it, and they were very nice to me when I went in there. But I don't think the whole time I was in the trial, I agreed to I never acknowledged it until I was later on a different medicine. But also, how was your son ever off untreated, with, schizoaffective disorder for any long length of time?
Oh yeah, many, many times. I can't give you specific lengths of times, but I can tell you that he's been hospitalized 26 times. And many of those times were because he stopped his meds. And really for him, it only takes a few days for him to revert and go into a psychosis.
I attribute a big part of my recovery to being, treated early. And, so schizophrenia is wrongly labeled a, mental illness or a psychiatric illness, whereas me, I feel strongly that it's a brain disorder like Alzheimer's. And like Alzheimer's, the longer it goes untreated, the harder it is to get. So I'm very grateful that I had that there was intervention early. And my heart goes out to people like your son that but so one thing that one part of the reason we're big supporters of AOT, which is assisted outpatient treatment, is a lot of times if it takes 26 hospitalizations, by the time they're on their meds, they're not able to have the life they would have been able to have. And also, explain what azoosinosia is.
Yeah, so anosognosia is the true lack of insight because there's been changes within the brain, usually in the frontal and parietal lobes, because of the illness itself, that makes the person unaware of their illness and unaware of their need for medication or treatment. And it's sort of like it's like trying to tell somebody who doesn't have diabetes to take insulin. It sounds really
Mhm,
scary. That's what it's like trying to tell somebody who doesn't believe that they have a mental illness that we want them to take an antipsychotic. It sounds very
mhm.
scary, right?
And
Potentially lethal. So it's pretty
the
understandable.
thing with azoosinosia is that's common in other neurological conditions like stroke victims, and it's different than denial. People try to lump it in when, say, someone has a drinking problem and they're in denial. Azoosinosia is different. Like denial, refusing to acknowledge something that is uncomfortable is not the same as having your brain black. I remember when I was in the hospital, I couldn't believe that they would put me in the hospital with the people the way they were acting, but I was acting just like them. So, so I thought
Right.
that looking back, I thought that was interesting. And then another thing I wanted to talk about, I know it's very painful that a lot of people really struggle with I know my mother. I have a family member with schizophrenia that is willing to take his meds, but doesn't have anywhere close to the recovery that I mean, his recovery looks a lot different. And a lot of moms and dads are just horrified as to what will happen after they pass on. And do you have that fear?
Course, I do have that fear. And it's hard to know, as you start investigating what to do about it, it's hard to know what are the right choices. And so we're currently pursuing trying to get that figured out and do some planning accordingly. Because that is a huge factor. You really do worry. We meet people all the time who don't have family left anymore. And we know exactly how difficult those people's lives are because they don't have somebody there advocating for them and looking out for them. We met one gentleman at a residential care facility that he literally had his shoes falling apart, and we bought him a new pair of shoes because nobody at that facility would even acknowledge that it was a problem, right?
Hmm.
These people are all over our country.
My concern is that if something were to happen to me, something were to happen to my mother, that any program that my brother would go to, they would just graduate him from the program and we're done with you. And have you
Right.
ever noticed that in mental health, graduating from a program is just code for we're dropping your services?
Absolutely. And they don't even hide it, hey, he's been stable at this level of support. It's time to take that support down, right?
Yeah, so it's like
And
the support the support is working, let's take it away.
exactly.
All
Exactly.
right. And has law did law these 26 hospitalization was law enforcement ever involved?
Yeah, it really was because his illness came on before we had things like mobile crisis or 988 or an access center. So we live in the county and we ended up using the sheriff's office to help us several times to get him admitted, unfortunately.
I was shocked when I had to have law enforcement at my house that just I mean I know it's different in different communities, but I basically when I called 911, I told them, "Hey, there's no guns in the house. I'm only concerned for his safety." I think I said it like 10 times. And the cops took the silent approach. No sirens, no headlights, parked a little bit up the road. And one thing that was very beneficial when the cops were at my house was that a lot of people that are shut-ins go to places late at night. So the fact that my brother recognized the cop and my brother knew each other from the gas station. So, and brings me to my next question. Being that your son's been in the hospital 26 times, are you on a first name basis with anyone in law enforcement? Um,
Yeah, I'm on a first name basis for a couple different reasons. One is I was a physical therapist here for a lot of years. And so over the course of time, I've treated a lot of the law enforcement officers in our community. I'm kind of a known quantity and friends with our sheriff, friends with other people. And so
mhm,
I've had a very privileged life.
mhm.
And I say this as a white woman in, a reasonable neighborhood. I understand that how we receive some of those services from our law enforcement was very different, probably, than some of the people who are of color, unfortunately. And so we learned the things to say, like you mentioned, there's no gun here. He's not dangerous. Please come without sirens so that you don't startle him. All those things you learn along the way, what to say to help keep everyone safe.
All right. And one problem that almost every family member runs into, which I believe is something that is known by people that oppose programs that we support, is well, basically, is I'm concerned with my family member's privacy. Like I'm not using his name, but I only have so many brothers. And the problem is when you have, say, ghost networks where the insurance company says this service is available, but it's not. If it's cancer, you're going to be calling your radio station, local press. If it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you don't want to go on TV and say and do that, which is why the ghost networks often exist in mental health, which is why the services don't exist because I've even heard people that have gone to the press, like the mental health department will just some activist will get mad, like you're violating their privacy. Yeah, and I wouldn't have to if you would do your job. But explain balancing privacy with your son's welfare.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think every family has to figure this out individually for what they feel comfortable with. Our compromise with our son is that we advocate, and my husband and I are pretty public about what's gone on, but we don't share his name. And we try to protect his privacy in that way. And it does put me at risk if he's not treated again, right? And I know that and recognize it and understand that that's a potential consequence that I just have to assume and accept. But the cause is too big. We have to be
Mhm.
speaking out. We have to be sharing our stories if we're going to make a difference and change things so that the next person that gets sick can get better treatment.
All right. Thank you. And yeah, it's one thing. I used to complain to all these people I knew, but I wasn't really doing any good. So part of the reasons I want to do that, I started doing this YouTube channel again, is so that other families and activists can say, "Oh, that my feelings are perfectly valid, and this is something that almost everyone in our situation goes through." So thank you
Right.
for sharing that, and explain what describe your son being fired as a patient.
Yeah. So, when somebody ends up needing to be rehospitalized over and over again, doctors get tired of treating them. And so they literally throw their hands up and say, your son is very sick, but we are tired of him not coming for appointments, stopping his medications, us having to work to get him readmitted. So we're no longer going to treat him. And they are just simply allowed to do that. And a lot of other providers also just do a lot of cherry picking, where they just decide they're not going to treat somebody who has Medicaid, which automatically takes out a huge portion of patients because most of the people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders end up on Medicaid, right? And so it soon becomes the fact that you have very few places where people with the most serious illnesses can get
Mhm.
treatment. And it's just so
Hey,
ethically wrong. And a more recent thing that we're seeing here in Iowa is that it's even harder to get people admitted to the hospital, even when they're meeting criteria, because they say things like, "Oh, the person's too suicidal," or "Oh, they used a substance and that's what caused them to go into psychosis." No luck. You're not coming here, and they street them right from the ED.
and they street. So you say street.
I say street, meaning they just put them back out on the street,
So
literally street them.
they've gone from the treating street to just shunning street. I guess this.
Yes, I guess that's
Oh,
a good way to say that. If they don't
okay,
arrest them.
okay.
Yep.
Arrest them. And also, the one problem that I've heard from a lot of activists is Medicaid was expanded under the Affordable Care Act, but the block money that hospitals like Grady and Big Charity in New Orleans got for treating the uninsured went away. So even though a lot of times they had that block grant where they can keep you long enough to stabilize you. Now you're expected, especially in states, a lot of states didn't even expand. Even states that didn't expand Medicaid lost the grant money to the teaching charity hospitals. So now it's just you're at the mercy of who takes Medicaid, and that is
That's
something
right.
that, yeah, so it's one thing like covering someone with a insurance like Medicaid that few people take for their illness doesn't really, it looks good on paper, but when rubber hits the road, it doesn't really look good. It doesn't do any good. It looks good, but doesn't do good. And have you ever had any pushback from peer advocates?
Oh, yes. Specifically, we had pushback after Kamala Harris published her mental health plan. My husband and I had a fair amount of input into her mental health plan when she was running for the presidency. And there were publications put out there, blogs and so forth with our names in it because people knew that my husband and I had been really fiercely advocating with all the presidential candidates for that. And so I had people reaching out to me through Twitter, through various social media channels, even writing about us, saying that we had undue influence upon um, these
Mhm.
plans. So I reached out to them and had conversations with them to help them to understand why we were advocating for the things that we did. And in most cases, the people who were pushing out most fiercely had no idea just how sick our loved ones are. Right. And so they're pushing back from a position where they don't know all the information. And once you are able to really just talk with them one on one, you make better inroads, at least temporarily. But yeah, we experienced a huge amount of
I know
hurtful pushback.
there was a woman that wrote an article in Vox talking about how apparently I don't have enough rights, in her words, but she had autistic spectrum. She didn't have schizophrenia. And it's one of those, she was making it about her. And I'm like, you're not even on my, like I said, there's other people that advocate on those types of issues. I'm advocating on people like me and my brother. And one thing that I run into is a lot of judgmental attitudes from, well, I'm mentally ill and I don't do that. Well, yeah, they're two
Right.
different, it's a broad spectrum.
That's
And
right.
also a lot of people that can serve on a commission aren't aren't exactly representative of people that need to be in the hospital.
That's exactly
And
right.
it's David, did you read David Axelrod's article in the New York Times?
Yeah, I thought it was great.
Yeah, so I've been wanting to find a way to get in touch with him for I don't know how I would do that, but I would love to get in touch with David Axelrod because of course he would love for his daughter, I believe she had epilepsy. And yes, there are people with epilepsy that live and thrive in the community. There are others that cannot. So you need everyone deserves to recover at their own level and not just be abandoned. So that is
Right.
something that I've experienced is a lot of judgmental and a lot of people I don't want to acknowledge you. They just don't want to acknowledge like, and that's something that we'll get to in a moment. But do people get angry? Like people get really angry when I say stuff like, a lot of these peer advocates don't speak, have never experienced anything as severe as me or my brother, and they're speaking from, in my opinion, a point of privilege where you're able to serve on the commission, and the person that and a false sense of expertise, like you're not an expert on this issue, like you have no expertise that is relevant to this, but they're using terms like I, me, and but one thing I've noticed is they get very angry when I say that. They get extreme. It's like a big slap in the face. Like, how dare you take away my I don't know my sense of I view it as a cheap form of radicalism. You get to go out there and fight against forced treatment, but you don't deal with it. Me and my mother will deal with it if he's off their meds. The police deal with it. I don't see you when stuff goes wrong. You're nowhere to be seen. But
Right.
people get really angry when I say that. But also another thing people get angry with is when people's like you say. Has anyone ever gotten mad when you say they cherry pick patients?
I would say that yes, some people have gotten mad, and honestly, I don't care. Some of us have to call out the reality of what's really
Mhm.
happening to people. And to go back to your comment that you were making about people with lived experience really pushing back against the treatment of people with the more serious illnesses. A lot of them are doing that because of negative experiences and traumatic experiences they had early on in their illnesses. And it feels to them like we're trying to put them at risk of going back into a hospital and having forced treatment, right? But also, there is an element of, I've chosen to do the work to be well. These other people, like my son, are simply just not choosing to take care of themselves,
Mhm.
right? And, you know, I want to both acknowledge that the traumas happened, right? Because we all know trauma happens sometimes in inpatient units, unfortunately. I also want to acknowledge how hard these people are working to maintain their mental health, right? It is hard work. But I also want them to be able to open up their minds and recognize that some people are just so much more sick that they cannot even have the opportunity to make a choice about their well being or them living on the streets untreated, right? And so it's a matter of hopefully gradually us being able to make some inroads in educating them as well to understand. And I really find it heartless when, testifying for AOT in other states, when they say, well, if we get AOT approved here, it's going to take away money for the services that I need. I'm thinking, well, what's your solution? How do we help our
Mhm.
loved ones then, right? If you offer
I
us another solution that would
I
work, we're open to it.
I always find it just bizarre that few people call them out on this. I'm advocating, on behalf of this person by keeping him from taking my service. He's gonna it's like, how is that like, forget the selfishness of, "I have the ability to serve on a commission, so I'm taking it from the most vulnerable." Why does no one in the press like, if I were chairing a commission, I'd be like, "What?" Like,
Right,
a lot of these disability rights groups in California are like they're fighting Governor Newsom of California tooth and nail, Senator Susan Eggman, and they're saying, "You're putting our rights at risk by giving our services to someone else." And I'm like,
right,
"Whoa, thank you. You're really courageous to come out. There's no one else you can get your money from other than Mark Rippey, the poor man."
right.
With I'm hoping
Who
eventually to
passed.
get an interview with his sisters, and because that
Awesome.
is it was it's I used to always be real differential and be like people were mistreated in the hospitals. After what the Rippey family went through, I just stopped caring. Like I get and another thing that I've encountered a lot is a guy on Facebook, a very prominent activist with lived experience, was attacking me on Facebook because it's my fault the mental health system is broken because I'm refusing to work together. And no, we're not going to work together by letting Mark Rippey die with his rights on. That's not I'm not willing to work together if that's the price. That's something I'm not willing to do. And
The
and
other
that's
point that I also like to point out, bear with me for interrupting you, but the other point I also like to put out is that if we actually treat the people who are the most sick well for the length of time that they need in the setting that they need, instead of having them go through the costly revolving door, there will be more mental health care available for everyone, right? It'll be
it,
more efficient. It'll
it'll
be
be
more
more
appropriate.
if there's early intervention, they won't need that level of service. But I find it ironic that the state with the highest that just from what I haven't seen any hard numbers, but just from what I've seen, the state of Michigan has AOT, and we have an interview on our YouTube channel with the Honorable Judge Milton Mack. But they also have the most peer advocates per capita because they work together. They don't just say work together, let your loved one die on the streets. And if you don't do that, you're the one being a troublemaker. And they actually
Right.
do work hand in hand. And yeah, that's something that I've never understood. I understand people care about their own views and some people are selfish, but I don't understand why the media wanted to say what. All right, and then explain the IMD exclusion.
Sure. So the IMD exclusion was part of the Medicaid Act of 1965 that was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was an act that was meant to help. They thought at the time that if they could keep facilities smaller, they could avoid some of the atrocities that had been happening at very large state psychiatric hospitals that were really underfunded and understaffed. And so what it does is it prevents federal matching Medicaid dollars being used for any psychiatric facility with more than 16 beds. And so it's been the largest driver of over deinstitutionalization of mental health care over the years. And unfortunately, it's still in place today. And a lot of people think it's all about reducing hospital beds, but in our county alone, I can tell you it reduces the amount of access at the Access Center. We have a brand new Access Center for crisis care at the beginning, and it only has 16 beds. Why? Because they need those Medicaid matching dollars. And at the other end of the continuum, we also have a residential care facility that also only has 16 beds. So it's affecting people all the way from accessing care to hospital care to long-term residential treatment. It's a really big problem that limits the care
And
of people with mental illnesses.
I've come to the conclusion. that I think a lot of people are so ideological that they don't care at this point. Like that's one thing and one thing that I come to the conclusion is how much cherry picking there is of statistics. For instance, they keep track. If you were to look up how many people have schizophrenia in a hospital, they say, "Oh, this many people are in the hospital. We got to get them out of the hospital." If you want stats on people in prison or homeless, I don't think the National Institute of Mental Health includes them in their statistics. And yeah, so there's no it doesn't affect your stats at all if someone is in psychosis and it's difficult for mom or brother to live with. That's just you. You're not on our radar. And because I believe I spoke with someone in Los Angeles. The Twin Towers jail has 5,000 people, but having more than 16 with a mental illness, but having more than 16 people in a hospital is just and it's just like, oh, it's oppressive. But I don't think the federal government even has stats, if they do that I'm aware of how many people with schizophrenia are in the county jails.
Right. I think you're right. I think they have just started counting them in a different way, but we all know that they're undercounted, especially the homeless population with people out there, because the average census counter is not going to know that some people with mental illnesses don't know they're sick and are unable to tell the
Yeah.
census worker, hey, I have schizophrenia, right? We all know that they're being undercounted there, and they certainly in the past have not been counting them in jails and prisons.
Well,
The
I
newest
read,
stat, though, that's been out and published is that every year we have 2 million people with serious mental illnesses cycling through our county jails. That stat is a devastating indictment of our society. The fact that we
well,
are taking such little care of people with
I'm
schizophrenia, they're going through our jail every year.
see, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you. I feel
Okay.
like blaming society takes attention away from people in authority positions. I think there's a lot of groups like I was going to mention the ACLU, PAMI, a lot of groups that maybe hold more responsibility because a lot of people, when they see a tragedy, they look to these groups. Because I've encountered people that are like, oh my God, I can't believe that man is allowed to live like that. We need to go call this group that supports him living like that. And so I do think society bears some blame, but I believe a lot more individuals and individual organizations are and that's part of what I want to do with this YouTube channel is just make sure that they're held accountable. So you can't just say, I'm too principled to have more than 16 people at this hospital. Well, society. So, but yeah, but I
I
do
know.
see your all right. And back
I
to my
guess I'm
next.
trying to I was
Go
just going
ahead.
to say, I'm trying to make a social movement. I'm trying to get a lot more people in our society to step up and care and help us to create change, right? We all do bear some responsibility. And yes, it's
Mhm,
the mental health care system that's broken. But we have to exert societal pressure to change it.
mhm.
So that's
And that's
my
my
point.
That's and I think you're right. All right. And then also on this, back to what I mentioned about the ACLU. The ACLU and PAMI, Personal Advocates of Mentally Ill Individuals. Have they helped you in any way? Or do they just show up and talk about how principled they are and disappear?
Yeah, honestly, I've had very little interaction with either of those groups. The ACLU representation in Iowa is really focused on many other issues. We have not run into them as being a competing force as much as we've seen in California and New York and other places.
All right. And has the sheriff's office, being that the sheriff's families and are the first responders. The second responders are often law enforcement. Have Has law enforcement helped you in your advocacy at all?
Yes. In our state, the sheriff's lobbying organization actually has been one of my partners in trying to push for more state beds. They have worked with us on this for year after year after year. So they've helped both at local level in terms of our setting up our first AOT program in our county. They were strong supporters in the door the first meeting, but also at the state level, they have been partners on many of the things that we're trying to push to improve mental health care.
All right. And you have a coordinating committee that you meet with different departments in, is it Johnson County where you are?
Yeah, it's called the Johnson County Systems of Care meeting, and it is a true community collaboration involving people from our hospitals, our law enforcement, various community mental health and substance use providers, the shelter house, our homeless agency. We are all coming together because we've opened a new access center, and many hope that that would solve a lot of the problem for getting people who are homeless in our community to treatment and to the care that they need. But we're recognizing that because that's a voluntary service, there's still a fair number of people who are ending up getting arrested for being mentally ill and ending up in our jail, and a fair number of people who are still unsheltered, unfortunately, and homeless. And so we're coming together to try to work on figuring out more ways to close these treatment gaps and get these people to care and shelter.
All right. One thing you mentioned the census taker, not knowing that someone is too sick to know they're sick. I read an article in the New York Times where they're like, if you go out and talk to the unhoused people, they say that mental illness is not the problem. And as someone who experienced agisonosia, I'm like, duh, of course, of course. Um, and anyway, but what's it called? Explain medical silos.
Oh, so everything is pretty siloed in the world of mental health care. If somebody's in the hospital, there's often not coordination to what the person needs when they get out of the hospital. In Iowa, for many years, the reimbursement for substance use treatment has been very separate from the reimbursement for mental health treatment. So it's been very difficult to get true integrated care for people who have co-occurring disorders. That's a classic example. They now combined the Department of Public Health with the Department of Human Services together, and they're working on marrying that and also certified community behavioral health centers. As those get funded and developed, those will also be helpful for reducing those silos and providing more integrated care.
All right. And let's discuss the Olmsted decision. And what is the Olmsted decision?
Yeah, so that was a Supreme Court decision where they ruled that people should be able to receive care and housing in the least restrictive environment. But the end of the sentence has really been co-opted by the insurance companies because the end of that sentence was the least restrictive environment where they can be healthy and thrive. And unfortunately, the insurance companies have come in there and just keep, like I said earlier, if somebody gets stable at this level of care, as soon as they are for a month or two, they want to go ahead and reduce that level of care. And what happens often, and I've seen this over and over again with our son, is somebody deteriorates and they end up back in the hospital and starting all over again, right? We have allowed for the insurance companies to do that. And that's part of our advocacy work is really to come back and try to figure out a way to codify that the treating providers decide the appropriate level of care and medical necessity from everywhere from in the hospital through subacute care through long-term care. I think that's one way that we could make a difference with that.
And that's something that insurance companies trying to use that to deny care. It's interesting because so much of this has people have the view, whether it's the insurance industry or activists who want services for other for different types of patients. It always comes down that our families are always at the bottom. Like once everyone else is taken care of, we'll get to you. Well, society will always have ills. If you wait for that, then like there's really I like I said, you and I know we're on the same page. I'm unwilling to do that. I'm unwilling to say, oh well. And insurance companies, yeah, that's something that is it's not insurance if someone needs a service. Like you're not a provider if you're not providing anything. And insurance is a whole nother topic because I've had a chronic condition since I was on my father's health plan as a teenager. It's really not insurance. It's more like chronic continuing care because a lot of people they didn't just get sick and decide they need health insurance. they've had these conditions since they were teenagers. So if I go out and get care, it's not like I already have the condition. So it's not like they're stepping healthcare. You don't just step in an emergency. You provide care throughout the lifetime. And insurance in this country is something that is just so many people have problems with it that I'm amazed that more is not done. And
I concur.
also with the Olmstead decision, it's often I've seen it interpreted where the goal is to get them out of the hospital. The goal is to get that money in the community, whether it goes to the person in the hospital or not. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her, who I believe wrote the opinion, made it clear this is not a open invitation to just throw people out that need care. So I think it is, and I hate questioning people's motives, but I've gotten used to it. People know in Georgia where I'm from. I live in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. There were people discharged to homeless shelters.
Yep.
Well, you know full well someone with with a severe mental illness is not going to last long in that situation. And it's interesting. If I were to the person who responded the quickest when I called to discuss this issue, I'm a night owl. I around midnight I messaged Sheriff Reynolds in Cherokee County where I live. By like 2 p.m. I was on the phone with him just because he was eager to talk. And it's the jails since the Olmstead decision, and I've just been filled. And part of the problem is I don't I don't like saying the cops have to be trained to handle patients in their jail because they shouldn't be there. And that's something that I know I don't know, that's getting on my soapbox, but um back to you said you were a physical therapist. Have you ever
Mhm.
noticed your son being treated differently when he is seeking non-mental health care?
Oh, absolutely, and not just my son. I've witnessed it with other patients, including the patients that I would treat as a physical therapist. I he had his, side effects completely ignored for 6 months when he was on a very gold standard med. They just kept saying it was all in his head, right? They never took him seriously. But I've also had PT patients. I had one woman who came to me after years of knee pain, and nobody had ever asked her to lift her pant leg to look at her knee until I did. And, she had grade 3 osteoarthritis, we found out once we got an X-ray ordered for her. That's medical malpractice. It really is. It's negligence. And it's way too common that people have their medical conditions ignored just because they happen to be taking a psychotropic medication or have a history that's in the chart. And we have to call that out and we have to change it.
All right. And one couple more things. Who was DJ Jaffe?
Oh, DJ Jaffe was an amazing, wonderful SMI advocate, probably the first one. Um, Not the first one, but he definitely was somebody. He was an advertising executive that lived in New York City who had a sister-in-law with schizophrenia, who once she came to live with him and his wife, and they were trying to get care for her, he really, dove into all the barriers to getting her care, and he stopped working as an advertising executive and founded his own organization. I think it was mentalillnesspolicy.org. And he led the way. He wrote this wonderful book called Insane Consequences, which is well researched, well sourced, that outlines the causes of the crisis for people with serious mental illness, and then also outline the solutions for it, right? And very much, he's definitely been a hero of ours. He was a good friend. And we're very sad that he's no longer with us.
Yes. Insane Consequences. He talks about in the book how his sister-in-law was fired as a patient for a perfectly valid for a perfectly valid complaint. Like, oh well. And yeah, but part of the reason I bring up DJ Jaffe is I used to tell him to do things. I'd say, shoot him a message like, "Hey, you should look into this," and he's like, "I think you should look into this." And his goal was not to be the supreme advocate. His goal was to bring more people like us into advocacy. And he used to always hold, and he wrote an article, or maybe it was just a Facebook post, and he's like, Leslie and Scott Carpenter are had no platform, and they just went out and created their he used to hold you up as the model advocates. And I was wondering, what can we do to bring more people into advocacy?
I love this question. I think we all need to be doing everything we can to train more advocates. I'm hoping the National Shattering the Silence Coalition will continue that work. They've done it before, and I'm hoping that will continue in the future. I'm hoping the Treatment Advocacy Center will continue that work. NAMI has already been doing that work with their days on the Hill and so forth. But we all have a responsibility when somebody reaches out to us for help and they say, hey, I want to learn how to advocate. We need to take the time to help them. I'm hoping maybe we can get more organized and do it more than just one at a time, which is the approach that I've had because that's what I wanted to do. But it would be really helpful if we held classes for each other, webinars, and I'm hoping maybe we can even pursue some collaborative efforts towards that effort.
All right. And describe what is a caucus for people that live in primary states?
Yeah. So caucuses are an event that's held during presidential years, but also non-presidential years, where the parties come together. And in the Democratic Party, which is what I belong to, but I want to say that I advocate in a bipartisan fashion. But during the time before our caucuses, we had, when we were first in the nation, huge numbers of candidates coming through Iowa a lot. But to answer your question about what is a caucus, it is you go together, you stand in a room, and everybody who's for one candidate joins together and they count them. And then people are in other parts of the room that are for the different candidates. And if somebody doesn't meet viability, then you go and you try to bring other people on board to your candidate. It is wide open. It's very different than voting in a primary, which is a very private situation. This is very public. You're in front of your friends and neighbors that live near you saying, hey, I'm voting for so and so. So it's really interesting and unique in Iowa. But because we used to be first in the nation, it gave us huge access to all the candidates, especially before the last election.
All right, because I noticed, yeah, you were able to speak with Camilla Harris, and good for her for actually taking the time to listen to you. Because I know a lot of times, people, I feel like the caucuses are just a getting your picture taken with someone in Iowa is just a formality. So, it's, oh yeah, I got my picture taken with these people, and because yeah, you just get your picture taken with a local and then leave. But Vice President Harris actually took the time to listen and incorporated a lot of it into her plan.
She did, and
So,
she wasn't the only one. We got a lot of time with all of the presidential candidates, and other ones came out with plans as well. Steve Bullock did. Cory Booker gave us a huge amount of time. Elizabeth Warren. Not all of them came out with extensive plans, but certainly we're seeing pieces of what we
mhm.
recommended, much of which we got from DJ Jaffe in various pieces of the Biden-Harris plan now.
All right, and I understand that Iowa no longer has the first in the nation caucus.
That's true. We don't. Not for the Democratic Party. We still do for the Republican Party.
And being that you were in a university town, you won't have, unfortunately, you won't have the same amounts of people coming there because I felt there's more caucus goers for the Republicans in other parts of the state.
Right. Yeah, I won't have access to all the Republican candidates like I did with all the Democrats, which is really unfortunate.
Well, I agree. That is very unfortunate. And but thank you for taking the opportunity when you did have it. And is there anything you'd like to close out with before we go?
I just want to say thank you for doing this interview. Thank you for your advocacy work. And please keep doing it. I think it's great. And I highly encourage you to keep doing it, interviewing different people. We all need to talk. We all need to learn from each other and collaborate with each other. So thank you.
All right. Um, thank you for all that you do, and I'll and thank you for all that you do, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Eric. Take care now.
All right.